Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our session today, which topic is Confronting COVID-19. This is part of a two-part panel discussion of this topic at the conference, Confronting Climate Crisis with Systemic Alternatives in the Age of the Coronavirus. So these conversations are centrally focused on the theme of the larger conference. I'm John Foran. I teach at UC Santa Barbara, which is hosting the conference, and I'm here with Giorgos Kallis and Shrishtee Bajpai, who are going to have a conversation with us. And I'd like to invite each of our speakers to introduce themselves and perhaps in the context of being enmeshed in this crisis of COVID-19. And I'll turn first to Shrishtee, please.
Thank you, John. So I'm Shrishtee. I'm from India, and I am part of a small collective, an environment action group, Kallis, and we have been working on environment and intersections of environment and development related issues. And so I find myself working in those intersections, but more so documenting and researching on radical alternatives that are challenging the dominant systems of economic and political governance and have their roots in the processes of concentration of power, basically. So statism, patriarchy, and other such concentrations of power. And so my research and my work and my activism revolves around documenting and networking and bringing these radical alternatives together. And I help in coordinating a process that sort of creates a space and a platform to bring these alternatives together so that there could be a space for cross-sectoral learning, exchanges, collaborations, and a collective envisioning for the futures. Which is called Alternative Consequences or Vikalp Sangam in Hindi in India. And I am also part of a coordinating team of a global process that is trying to do a similar thing at the global level of bringing together networks of alternatives and creating and weaving a tapestry of alternatives and what we can learn from each other and create a sense of a political mass of an envisioning for the future. Which is called Global Tapestry of Alternatives, and being involved in youth collectives and movements that are trying to challenge the systems and also build a better world. As a personal level, I think the crisis has been very challenging in many ways, also to witness the kind of atrocities people had to go through in these times and kind of decisions that especially in decisions that the government took here in India, it was very, very difficult to see the most vulnerable and the marginalized going through all of that. And also finding oneself stuck in cities and not being connected to nature, to the world in the kind of way one aspires to was limiting and also kind of difficult to process through. But I think one at least the kind of groups we worked with and were involved with, there was a lot of reassurance for the kind of work we do, and also the emerging and a lot of active collectives, movements of solidarity that emerged in these times, inspired and made us work and continue even in these very desperate times, and still continues to do so. So yeah, very difficult, but yet something that recharged and regenerated the spirit to move forward.
Thank you very much, Shrishtee. Giorgos?
I'm Giorgos Kallis. I'm Greek. I'm based in Barcelona, in Spain. I'm a professor here in an Institute of Environmental Studies. My background is all over the place. I've done chemistry, engineering, economics, environmental planning. So I consider myself an interdisciplinary and disciplinary scientist, which what drives me is to understand the causes of environmental degradation and the causes of environmental injustice, and what we can do about it, and what we can do in terms of systemic alternatives, because I think environmental and social injustice is not only a problem that can be corrected by policies or by institutions or by laws. Is a systemic, it's a symptom of the system. So we have to think about transforming the system. Over the years, this has brought me to a label, an umbrella term for such systemic alternatives, what here in Barcelona or in Europe we call degrowth. And I have been part since 2009 perhaps, that I arrived here in Barcelona, a member of a collective, you might call it think tank, you might call it an NGO, that we set up a team of researchers and activists from the city of Barcelona, but we call it research and degrowth. And we are trying to link our research with activities of dissemination, intervention in the political sphere, intervention also in the social movement sphere, and keeping alive a discussion around the problems with economic growth and alternatives we might want to think to growth-based development. I've written quite a lot on the topic, and I take the opportunity of this conference and the invitation of John, for which I thank him a lot, to talk a little bit today about my recent book, co-authored with Susan Paulson from Florida and my colleagues here in Barcelona, Giacomo D'Arisa and Federico De Maria, a book which is coming out in the US 7th of November, and it's called The Case for Degrowth. So it's a short book where we articulate the case for degrowth, I think, in quite novel terms, which I'm going to talk about later. A book by Polity Press and a short book where we make the case for degrowth. On a personal level, I live in Barcelona in Spain. You might know is the country that for some unexplainable reason is the country worst hit by the COVID crisis in Europe. No one can really say why, because the lockdown here has been like extreme from the very beginning. Everyone is wearing masks all the time outside of the houses. Spaniards are quite social people, so this might explain part of it, but also Greeks are, and I'm Greek. And in Greece, they barely registers COVID as a problem. I mean, there is, but it's very low. So it's like an unexplainable epidemic that I think also shows us sometimes the limits of science and of trying to understand and control everything. I passed the first 2 months closed in the house. We couldn't go out. For me, it was a strange personal period. Not a strange. It was a pleasant, surprisingly personal period, because I had my twin daughters just before the lockdown in February. I'm a first-time father, and I was really happy with that. So being closed in the house with my two daughters was not bad. I enjoyed it a lot. We had the time we needed to spend with them. And of course, I also benefited from generous, perhaps for North American standards or rest of the world standards, not so generous for European standards, parental leave. So I had 4 months of parental leave, paid actually more than my salary, and having the relaxed state of mind of having to stay here with my children and my wife, which shows the importance now of, for me, I mean, I would argue these things at an intellectual level, but at the practical level, so the importance of having support for people in difficult circumstances and exceptional circumstances to take care of themselves and their kids. No? And one important idea that we are trying to promote now in this book on degrowth is the idea of universal care income. This is the universal basic income, but twisted with a logic that it's not just to address poverty or to make sure that everyone shares equally on the commonwealth, which is important, but much more in the context of this crisis, an income that secures that everyone can be compensated for this important and super important and basic role, which is reproductive work, the work we do in our houses to take care of ourselves and take care of others. Yes, so I think I'm ready to join the conversation and get into the more specifics of how we see the COVID crisis, but also how we see it integrated with the other crises we are facing.
Thank you, Giorgos. I want to thank both of you for those introductions. The personal is definitely political and vice versa, and we're all living through this. And viewers may have seen my mom, Ramona, passing in the background. I'm sheltering in place at a house that she rents here in Santa Barbara. My mom, Ramona, is 92 years old, and so we're being as very careful as we can here. She was also a teacher, which is, I think, been a big influence on me. So I wanted to introduce her. I'm at home. My office is in the living room facing the wall. And yeah, she's just got up late and having her morning coffee. She didn't know I was doing this. All right, so on we go. Thank you both. Both of you invoked the sort of both unique peculiarity of a pandemic, but also laid over a whole set of structural issues, ongoing crises that we're aware of. And before we get to the talking about the all-important alternatives and systemic alternatives in particular, I'd like to give each of you the floor to try and analyze the crisis in any context as you see fit, your observations about it as a crisis of our time. And we'll go right back to you, Giorgos, and start with yourself.
Yes, in our book, The Case for Degrowth, the second chapter that we start, where we set out our diagnosis of the crisis, which at the time of the writing, pandemic is not on our radar, no? But we diagnosed the current ecological, economic, and social crisis as a crisis, not as it is often seen as a failure of the economic system that has to be corrected, or a failure to sustain growth, or failure to green growth, to make growth more ecological. But we diagnosed it as a problem of a system that it's geared and designed, in a sense, designed not consciously, but designed implicitly around the pursuit of growth at all costs. Our diagnosis is that the current system, the current economic system, especially in the so-called global north, not in the west, the economic system that was constructed in the 1930s to the 1950s, let's say, a system that was based around the constant expansion of the system in order to reproduce itself and in order to maintain stability, has reached a limit beyond which it starts devouring itself. It's what anthropologist Julie Livingston called the self-devoured growth. What do we mean by that? What we mean is that sustaining the rates of economic expansion and growth that have been customary and have been necessary for the system to remain stable, the 2 or 3% growth that we often hear is necessary for an economy to continue functioning well, requires more and more sacrifices, more and more social sacrifices, austerity cuts that we had here after 2008, cuts to public consumption and public goods, and at the same time, environmental sacrifices. It requires putting more and more nature into this machine, this engine of growth to fuel it. It requires also deregulating environmental standards and social standards and labor standards that right now are a dead weight on growth. No, they stop growth, they slow down the economy. So in the book, the metaphor we do is like that we are in a particular civilizational moment that other civilizations have also faced, that our gods are betraying us. And we argue that the god of secular societies has been not a spiritual god, but we have substituted spirituality with the god of the economy, the god of an ever-expanding economy. We let's say paint this god with a crazy graph of our gods, which is the 3% growth each year curve. And if you plot this curve, you will see that the economy by the end of this century, we expect it to be 12 times bigger than it is now and tending to infinity within the next 1 or 2 centuries. So our argument is that this is a crazy idea, and it's to future archaeologists, if they ever found our remains, it will seem as crazy as, when we found older civilizations. I'm Greek, and sometimes I read stories about ancient Greeks were pretty clever people, no? They invented philosophy, they developed mathematics, but somehow they had all these crazy stories that they believed about the 12 gods up in the Olympus mountain doing all sorts of crazy stuff, no? And you would wonder, why would they think this way? And I think in the equivalent way, someone who would look back into our civilization would say, okay, they were clever people in many ways, but like, how did they believe in this stupid idea, that they could have an economy that would go up to infinity? How did you have also clever people? I'm debating all the time with economists, but they keep coming with clever arguments to tell us how the economy can grow, 12 times by the end of the century and nothing be a problem, It's services, they make strange arguments, they tell me that utility doesn't have to be material, etc., etc. Full stop here because I talked too much. Just to link it to COVID. So the COVID crisis came as our book was going to the press. And then we said, how do we position this vis-a-vis our book? We don't want to be prophets after the doom, right? Because everyone now says, oh yes, the pandemic is justifying what we were always saying. Let's be honest and say that we were caught off guard with what happened as much as many other people. Now, this was something that wasn't in our radar. We're talking about climate change. We would hear people talk about diseases, but I never thought that this could take the extent of what it took. But again, if we were to go back and reflect on what happened, and reflect on the one hand on how this pandemic expanded, which expanded first of all through a globalized economy very quickly, through the airplane networks of a hyper-globalized and hyper-accelerated economy. But also the causes, many experts who have studied ecologists argue that it has to do with the loss of biodiversity and the encroachment of human habitat further and further into nature, and the encounters with wildlife that is now carrying these viruses. So on both sides, we see that the growth-based expansion of the economy is at the root of this pandemic. But I think even more important, it's at the root of the inability of so-called developed economies, rich economies, high-income economies, to respond the way one would normally expect these economies and these societies to respond. So the total failure that we observe, not only in the USA, but you have your particular political circumstances, no, but also in other countries. I would include Spain in that, where the government, I'm quite favorable to them, but the inability of a public system to organize itself, organize both the economy, but also organize the response in a collective way to a crisis that came from the outside is outstanding, I would say. It's like outlandish. We never thought such a big failure. And this failure, and here I am a little bit of prophet after doom, I think it has to do with all the erosion of state mechanisms and public infrastructures that took place in the name of growth and as a result of austerity the previous 10 to 20 years. I think it's an important moment because something we have been arguing as scholars of post-development or degrowth these years, that these metrics we make of development based on GDP are false. I think it's something that now will become much more common sense to people. So to claim right now that the US or the EU are the more developed parts of the world, when you see countries like Vietnam or countries like South Korea or other countries with much less of the GDP of these countries, and how effectively and without big drama and without human loss or suffering they managed to curtail this virus, I think it makes us really think seriously what it means development and whether it has to do with general income or with something else.
Over to you, Shrishtee. Thank you, Giorgos.
Thank you, Giorgos. I think Giorgos has covered the crisis quite comprehensively. So I'm just going to reinforce and restate also based on what happened in India. Like just rest of the world, I think all of us went through this whole, and we are still going through this period of massive uncertainty. And regardless of what history will prove, the pandemic has brought out the challenges ranging from social, economic, political, environmental, which are going to be there for quite some time. And it has also especially put a lot of vulnerable sections in even more vulnerable situations, especially the indigenous peoples in India, the Dalits, Adivasis, women, and other such marginalized sections. Extreme, what one can say is that the poor were out of the government's imagination in terms of analyzing what would be the impact of their decision making. So what we see is this current rise of authoritarianism, centralized top-down actions, um, and where workers' way of even going back was not even in the administration's, in the government's imagination. And so there were people walking thousands and thousands of kilometers just to go back to their villages. From the city centers, they lost their faith in cities where they had come all the way through their villages to work. And they realized how cities just left them, they did not care about them. So this horror of dominant regimes, which was hidden from people in some ways, but was of course continuously suffered by majority, even more starkly came out during the COVID crisis. And I think there is no better time to realize that the market and the state will not be able to take care of people. And their struggle for survival and their struggle and their expression of their agency is the only thing that they have. So maintaining their autonomy, maintaining their self-reliance is something that they have. And that will be the significant factor to actually come out of these exceptional circumstances. And it has, as Giorgos was saying, it has, of course, sharply brought out our disconnect with the rest of nature. The way we have been, the patriarchal mindset that has sort of captured human imagination has also created this great rift between human and rest of nature. And there's no doubt now, and various scientific studies do prove that the pandemic was a result of that. And so one sees that there's lots of, and especially in India, this lockdown period was used to pass laws without and propose policies or draft notifications to some of very important laws without any public consultation or dialogue. So it's just this creating this whole statist model where spaces for dialogue, dissent are even more stifled. And in fact, passing laws and judgments that further dilute environment impact assessment notifications law, so going just opposite to what the governments should be doing, which is conserving, protecting the biodiversity. Our Prime Minister has has come up with a plan to a post-COVID recovery plan to actually, by auctioning 40 new coal fields in most biodiverse and eco-sensitive regions of the country. So there's just this, the governments, the corporations, and this whole growth at any cost model is still something that has a strong hold and is being used still. And the governments and corporations are not realizing, and they don't want to realize, of course. And so this is still, this period is still being used, and people's way of protesting and showing dissent and going out in India is even becoming tougher. And there one of our high courts has said that there is certain line of how much people can protest and show dissent. So this is something that that we are seeing emerging, and the crisis is increasing. But of course, there's also an insurgent spirit that is being manifested in thousands of acts of caring and sharing that emerge during these times. Lots of solidarity networks, relief measures for vulnerable, strengthening of new emergence of localized exchanges of food and other essentials, and protecting non-human or more than human from abuse and destruction are some of those becoming more visible in the world. And I think this is the time where such pluriverse of alternatives or people's ways of being and articulating their own ways of social life is also opening up, and in many forms and in many ways. So I don't want to go long, but at the time of crisis, there's also a small opening for opportunity, and there's where I think we have to now focus upon.
Thank you both. I mean, that's the perfect segue into the final part of this conversation. Parenthetically, or as if it's more than a footnote, I'd like to add that living in the United States at the time of this crisis in an election year, we're less than 4 weeks at this moment away from the election. Having the President of the United States get COVID himself, and still is recovering from it at this moment, because of his own policies, and as Shrishtee said, the completely patriarchal elitist mindset of the elites of this country, politically and economically. That election is going to be a referendum on the grossest misconduct in the handling of this crisis, probably worldwide, when looking at the number of deaths, the number of cases, and the unnecessary, as it were, numbers of deaths and cases because of an incredible ignorance, an incredible self-centeredness, an incredible sort of, I don't know, greed-driven approach to life as we know it. The pandemic has revealed all of that in deadly terms. We're going to now talk about systemic alternatives, which is something all three of us think, live, eat, dream, and breathe. And we're going to turn first to Shrishtee to talk about what about systemic alternatives in the midst of this crisis going forward?
Yeah. As I was saying, that this crisis has opened up the opportunity to also for a lot of people to see that how self-reliance, autonomy, sovereignty, relocalization, processes of where you were able to take your own decisions of the most essentials and basic needs of life can actually help you deal with the crisis and the pandemic. And so as soon as the crisis happened, there were a lot of questions that were going around. And also we realized that with the process, while there's lots of stress and lots of problems, there are several communities who have been part of this network of Vikalp Sangam and alternative consumers have been able to deal with the crisis in a much more better way than many other communities, and especially cities that found themselves extremely vulnerable because we had our food coming from somewhere else. We are completely dependent on the market, external market, and India, like the rest of the world, desperately needs to find alternative pathways to well-being and help generate dignified livelihoods for all, and also move towards ecological sustainability and self-empowerment of communities, both rural and urban, and also the capacity to be able to govern and manage our food, health, water, energy, shelter, education, just realizing whatever our basic needs are, and where possible there's a self-sufficiency. And there were several examples that emerged as ways of actually defending their local ways and culture specific norms in the face of virus. And I just want to highlight a few because they have been crucial in inspiring processes in other parts of the country, and also of what we can learn from them and how they can inform our pathways to futures. So one of the examples is of Deccan Development Society in India, where women 25, 30 years ago, and these are women, these are Dalit farmers, which is a further marginalized caste in India, and these were landless women. They had very, very small, and some of them had just very, very small piece of land, and they were doing farming in a dryland area with their own processes of building not just food security, but food sovereignty. They were absolutely, we had a conversation with them, and they were absolutely unaffected by the pandemic. And they had their own food, they were not dependent on anything outside. And in fact, when the migrants came back from the cities, they were able to provide them food, and not just any food, nourishing, healthy millet-based food. So it and they had absolutely no dependence on external market, and they could just, their ties with nature, with land, and attempts at regenerating life in a much more broader way, also doing filming, documenting their stories of what women are doing. They could find ways and means of actually dealing with this whole crisis. Another example is Central India, where a forest-based indigenous community who has been struggling against mining projects, but along with that has also been trying to localize their livelihoods, their forest-based livelihoods, gain control over their traditional forest, and and creating systems of autonomy where people, through traditional systems of decision making, as well as some modern systems of decision making, just finding intersections between the two, they have been able to create a system where they could decide for themselves what happens in their village, what happens in their territory, and formed a federation of around 90 village assemblies. And during this time, because of their existing processes of generating local livelihoods, they had enough to not just provide for their villagers while they were dependent, and of course, because of their forest dependence, they were not dependent on the external food and markets. But especially for people who are coming outside, they could provide food and ration for 3 or 4 or 5 months, and could generate their own sense of dependence and their own sense of interdependence. And there are several such communities who started kitchen gardens, who did seed exchanges. There's one such community in Northeast India that actually stopped any outsider to come in and could manage everything within their villages. While having these dialogues we have been organizing online dialogues with several of these communities who have been practicing, um, because of their existing systems of trying to do different things, challenging the dominant systems, but also creating their own systems of change. We realized that a lot of them, of course, it's not to say that they were not affected at all, but a lot of them were able to manage and respond to the crisis in a much better way. And in fact, also start rethinking about what is the dependence that we have to reduce. So Kunaria Panchayat, one of the panchayats in one of the regions in this west of India, has now started rethinking, because of their existing processes, did a lot of interesting stuff, but have also now started thinking, how do these essential services like soap, other such commodities of basic use that we are dependent upon from the external market, food, medicine, soap, how can we generate these urgent and basic necessities in our own village, in our own village assemblies? What we see is this sense that is emerging very strongly of principles of autonomy, self-reliance, resilience, localization, solidarity in these times, and sovereignty, and strongly rooted in harmony with the rest of nature. We have also been, through Global Tapestry of Alternatives, been organizing these dialogues at very global level. And again, there are several examples of how communities in Europe, in Mexico, in Central Asia, in Africa, came together, found ways of showing solidarity, and also learning from their past and envisioning for the future. So yes, several of these communities, I think, across the world, which we need, I guess, to visibilize more, have been practicing these principles and have been able to respond, heal, learn, and self-govern and protect themselves from this madness in a much more better way than I think many of us could.
Thank you, Shrishtee. And it makes the point that so much of what's happening in the world in a positive sense, in a constructive, in a future life-affirming sense, passes under the radar of most of us. And these are crucially important experiences that everyone benefits from knowing about. And I want to thank you for the work you're doing in that regard, because this is how collaborative solutions are found, through this kind of exchange of knowledge. And that leads me to Giorgos, who is differently located in Barcelona, Spain.
Yeah. In the context of Europe, we articulate the alternatives, as I said, in our work under the keyword of degrowth. By degrowth, we mean slowing down, reducing our rate of using energy and resources, reducing the rate at which we churn goods and we take resources out of the earth to produce industrial goods. So one aspect is slowing down, and the second is sharing. So it's sharing more equitably and sharing between those who have too much and those who have too little, sharing what we already produce and consume, which I argue is more than enough. I'm talking about, again, here in the context of Europe. Now, up to now, we have made this case for degrowth at a pretty abstract conceptual level as a response to the other abstract conceptual big idea, which is economic growth, which is the dominant one. So we have tried to show why this model doesn't work and why we need an alternative model with a different logic that prioritizes slowing down and sharing. But in the new book that we wrote now, The Case for Degrowth, we tried to go a little bit more on speculating, in a sense, how could such a transition take place now, because just us arguing at a very abstract and high level that we need something different will not make it happen, no matter how much we yell about it, no? And we are not that many, actually, so it's not also that we are the majority, no? Or the more visible politically, because in the more visible level and the more high level politically, you still have the people who pump up the need for growth at all costs, or at best green growth or inclusive growth. So in the new book, we took the challenge of like, okay, how do we imagine this transition? And rather than starting from the upper level, no, the top level of politics or of big ideas, we started from the bottom, and we said, if we think that economic growth too, it was not a problem, it was not a project that was just envisaged by some upper-reaching elites which said, that's what we want and that's how we're going to do it now. It was a project that fitted the interests of the elites, but it was a project that was also born through particular political, cultural, and social conjectures in a particular period of time. We might say from the 15th to the 18th century in Europe, first Italy, Netherlands, England now. There was a particular culture of growth, we might say, a culture of technological innovation, culture of exploitation also, culture of hierarchy, of exploiting other people in order to fuel your machines. There were the enclosures, so there were political moves and movements that let this culture realize itself. So there was this conjecture. So we were saying, if we want to think that there is if we want to think, someone might call it wishful thinking, but I think it's more than that. I think it's positive thinking, because society changes through positive thinking. So if we want to think positively, that a change in the direction that we call degrowth, what someone else might call commons, or give it a different name, no? If we want to think that this transition could take place, where would it start from? And that's how we base our book. So rather than starting from the picture of politics or policies and what needs to be done at the policy level or the institutional level, we start by trying to grapple with the question of who right now embodies these ideas, which type of cultures, which types of groups of people on the ground level are embodying what we imagine and call degrowth. And what we argue in the book is that the seeds, the first signs of such an alternative emerging is on what many people have called the movement for the commons. The movement not only for reclaiming and defending the commons, but there is an important movement of making new commons on the ground, from different ways of producing and consuming, different ways of agriculture, zero-kilometer agriculture, cooperative agriculture, a big cooperative movement around clinics, around living together, co-housing. Also on the digital sphere, which is important, the movement for global knowledge but producing locally, the open software movement, the Wikipedia and the Wiki Commons. So we see that there is an important and parallel, and as you said, John, under the radar many times, not our radars, but the radars of society at large, or the media, with exceptions every now and then. No? There is an important substratum of economic activity and a different culture forming. So in our book, we argue that this is the base through which something can emerge. But we don't stay there and we don't stop there, because we find problematic if we only stop there and expect that somehow this culture will erupt and be generalized. So then the next stage we were thinking is, how could this culture of the commons and these economies of the commons be articulated with a reclamation and a reformation of the state, with a different type of politics. So there we follow, I'm getting too academic here, but we follow a Gramscian theory of political change, and we mix it with Eric Olin-Wright's theories of transformation and political transformation in his work on envisioning real utopias. No? So we try to think of the combination of practicing and embodying alternatives on the ground level, and at the same time organizing politically so that we create the conditions for these different projects that we do at the local level, these different commons that we make, to proliferate. Now, each one of us are a little bit product of our own places, and our wishful thinking sometimes are influenced by what we experience. So we recognize in the book and acknowledge that a lot of this inspiration comes because we are based in Barcelona. And in Barcelona, there has been historically, and even more in this time, there has been a strong and important cooperativist movement. So there is already an economy here in the city that operates on a parallel level, producing and consuming differently, organizing differently. And at the same time, this parallel economy and sphere, organized politically during the Occupy movement, the Indignados movement, as it was called here in Spain, which was one of the first places in Europe where the squares were occupied, and evolved into a political movement that is governing the city since 2015, I believe, or 14, so 14 maybe. With all its limitations and all its drawbacks, no? We should never be too romantic, no? But in the book, we argue that this model, which we have theorized ex post, but we were part of it now, and our theory is part of what was happening in the debates that were taking place in Barcelona. We think this model holds promise for transformation in the particular historical moment that we live in the global north, or in the west at least now. A combination between an alternative economy being created on the ground, community economies or economies of the commons, organized politically though, and through social movement action that materializes into political power, doesn't stay only at the level of social movement mobilization, creates the conditions for more and more of these economies to expand and proliferate and be protected. So that's the model that we articulate for the first time in full as the case for degrowth. So we don't start just from the critique of growth, but we start from the point of view that there are people for whom degrowth, in the general sense now, is how they imagine meaningful lives and how they organize their time and efforts to live meaningful lives.
Thank you, Giorgos. Thank you both. As we come to the end of this conversation, I want to express my thanks to both of you as inspiring scholars who have embraced activism as a way of life and made those connections and continue to make those connections happen, and to break down the barriers that exist between quote unquote scholars and quote unquote activists. Because we're all talking about, as Ashish Kotari, one of our colleagues, has put it, ordinary people living through extraordinary times. And you both underline all kinds of important points for me, which are tied together to some degree in a beautiful volume called Pluriverse, a post-development dictionary, where listeners can go and find literally dozens of ideas and on-the-ground practices about systemic alternatives, which is really our theme and our future and what is needed. I'd like to also thank the viewers for joining us and to invite them, if we're in real time, this conference will be open for questions and answers with the speakers, with anybody in the world, through an online process of starting conversations around these ideas and others. So we hope there'll be lots of participation and that we'll hear more from each of you as that grows. So I'm going to close with gratitude for opening hearts and minds to share hope, and to do so on the basis of love, of affirming life, of solidarity, and of working together. These are real things, and these are embodied in your practices and those of everyone around you. And we just, I'm grateful. I'm going to end with that thought. Thank you so much, Giorgos, Kallis, Shrishtee, Bajpai, for joining us, and let this conversation continue. Many thanks.